You're listening to Health is Membership, a podcast brought to you by MKM Architecture and Design that's looking to better understand the connection between placemaking and well-being. My name is Zach Benedict. I'm an architect working in Northeast Indiana, and I'm sitting down with innovators across the care continuum to examine how we can redefine a culture of health throughout the Midwest. For me, if we're going to have a serious discussion about placemaking in the Midwest, there's only one place to start, by calling Lohren Deeg. Lohren is a longtime mentor and friend. He's an associate professor of urban planning at Ball State University and has worked with countless small towns over the years. Lohren is special. He has this knack for understanding the soul of a place, a rare talent for articulating a community's vision on their own terms. He primarily does this through drawing, rapidly doodling ideas while sitting in a coffee shop talking to the regulars. For him, sketching is a process to help understand a place, its people, and their ambitions. It's a dedication I wish more people had, and the reason we invited him to the show. Lohren.
Hello.
How are you?
Great. How are you today?
Good. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, I know we've talked about this before in the past, but one of the things that I wanted to ask you and kind of get your perspective on this is, with everything that's going on, pandemic, economy, recession, it seems like an appropriate time to revisit the future and trajectory of rural communities, small town, Main Street America.
Yes.
What do you think is the current challenges facing those communities right now in terms of health, well-being, quality of life?
I think it's a great time to sort of look at the lens of how we've been living for the past 59 days and look at the things that have facilitated the way that you and I, people like you and I, have been able to continue living and working and contributing, and put on a list of things, mentally otherwise, things that we basically take for granted. We take for granted the ability to have a modicum of broadband access that allows us to continue our work in the way that we're doing, that allows us to have the conversation we're having right now. I'm not on a hard line right now. I'm actually using cellular data for this, but it works just fine in my neighborhood. For the most part, there have been some afternoons in the last 60 days where you can tell the demand has changed, where demand is high between 2 and 4 p.m. But for a rural community, that's not even part of the discussion yet. And I think politicians like presidential candidate and Senator Amy Klobuchar were I think appropriate to raise the issue of rural broadband as an economic development opportunity and as an economic development necessity, so that communities can have this type of conversation that we're having right now in terms of how one starts to revive and revitalize around these issues. And if you look at I think the critical nature of rural communities and their course in the supply chain, I was listening to the CBC this morning, and they were talking about euthanizing thousands of heads of swine. That how critical that rural communities are into the food chain. And if you want to talk about the future of work and talk about just-in-time manufacturing and smart supply chains, you've got to start with rural broadband as a critical element of that. It doesn't go beyond that. I mean, I can tell, being a distance educator for the last 60 days, that broadband access was an issue and is an issue for my students right now. Good broadband or good Wi-Fi was an issue in terms of when they were able to connect and when they were able to do their work, as well as sharing hardware with parents and siblings.
Right. But we've run into that with public libraries where we've worked in communities where they are a one-for-one school where students were getting laptops, but vast majority, 80-90% of the homes didn't have broadband at the house.
At all.
So the public libraries then became these havens of Wi-Fi access where the library is open for 4 hours a day, but the parking lot's full for 9 hours a day. People sit in the parking lot to use the Wi-Fi access from the library.
Correct. And prior to that, the local McDonald's would often be the Wi-Fi hub for many communities, or even inner city communities, like just down the street in Muncie here. The McDonald's at the corner of Charles and Madison basically was a broadband hub for a lot of the working class and working poor of that neighborhood. And when the McDonald's closed, then McDonald's parking lot became the Wi-Fi hub. And so part of my earlier tweet this month about revitalizing in the Carnegie Library model of revitalizing neighborhood schools and small town schools as innovation hubs or as distribution hubs for food, for community services, for broadband, for job creation, for home makers, home-based makers, smaller supply chain-based markets, handmade goods and the like, was that these school buildings still exist and across the rural Indiana landscape, across the rural Midwest landscape. They're now private houses. They were small restaurants. They were community centers, but in other cases, the Carnegie Library is still very much a legacy in the community, and folks like yourself have added on to them or renovated them. And then in inner city Indianapolis, these former school buildings, these former IPS buildings, if they haven't been torn down, are still fixtures in neighborhoods. If we can take that land and take those buildings and see them as a new type of innovation hub for these types of issues of food security, of broadband access, for distance learning facilitation, if we do continue down this path, then that for the facilitation of the exchange of home-made goods or home-based businesses, that could be a very critical physical and economic stimulus that could have a great broad-reaching equity for rural communities and for inner city communities.
Do you think the pandemic has or will be enough of a jolt to the system for communities to reevaluate this perception of what the efficiency of scale is? Because to your point, when we're talking about revitalizing or repurposing these neighborhood schools, they were done in a way that the scale and the efficiency of them were measured much differently than they are today.
Yes, I agree. The image I try to instill in people is the neighborhood school in the film Hoosiers, because it's a neighborhood school that instills an image for a lot of folks who see the movie on a regular basis. And the fact that neighborhood school was walkable, that neighborhood school was scaled to the community. And ironically, in the script, the issue of school consolidation is seen as a virtue of progress in mid-century America. The issue of school consolidation to make the classrooms bigger, to make the school buildings bigger, to make the basketball team better, becomes a competitive advantage for rural school corporations to consolidate and create these very large, sweeping rural campuses that students ride 45 minutes to an hour on a bus every morning. But it's ironic that movie is set in a time when the rural school was still a thing, and when the image of that rural school is portrayed in the film. So it's an image I like to share with people because I think it underscores that potential of that time, and there's some many feelings of nostalgia that are stirred with that movie and with the memory of a neighborhood school.
I was speaking on a panel probably last year, and another person on the panel who I didn't know at the time had mentioned that they had just done some analysis to try to look at where the most automated robotics were in the country. And looking at his map, I kind of off the cuff jokingly said, if I look at this map right, there's more per capita robot operators in Northeast Indiana than anywhere in the country. And he said, yeah, that's right. If you classify robots as, automated machines and all this. And I thought, well, there tends to be, again, this Midwest humility where I know a lot of people that work in what would be deemed robotics and are, in a sense, a robot operator. But when you ask them what they do for a living, they say they work at a factory. Right. And there is that kind of that Midwestern humility. I don't know what else to call it, that I think plays into this discussion of what are these rural communities going to be in the future. In some ways, it almost feels like, and being a product of it myself, They almost get in their own way in trying to understand really where they differentiate themselves, their talents, and their abilities.
Absolutely. I've been before the pandemic, I would hang out on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, with several folks who were involved in metal manufacturing, metal products manufacturing globally, right here in Muncie. And one metal operator would be in China. He would have to visit China at least twice a year. The other was basically the CAD designer for the entire company, and he was literally looking for new products to try to launch in a global supply chain, and all of that. Their entire business is going to have to change. They know that. They know that now. That there is a supply chain interruption means the end of their business.
Yeah.
So if a pandemic has an impact on their supply chain, it means a complete retooling of something. And you've seen that now with the retooling around ventilators and the retooling around masks. That just-in-time manufacturing was a really great buzzword 10 years ago. Now it's become a necessity in terms of how just-in-time can be nimble enough to save lives. So I see great potential there as well. But again, if they're not connected by rural broadband, then then it goes back to the beginning of the discussion.
So if there was a Guinness World Book record for individuals who've sat and had a cup of coffee in the most main streets in America, I would put your name in the hat of having sat in.
I would nominate J.B. Jackson first of all.
Okay, then close second.
I would nominate him. There's a great documentary on him on Canopy right now, if you want to check that out. Canopy is a streaming service that's available with a library card, just as an example of the library of video that is available for folks who have access to the library. But I would put him first. There's a scene of him in the documentary.
Okay, I'll concede. Him first, you second.
And I would nominate Jim Segedy second, but he doesn't drink coffee.
We won't tell Jim you said that.
He doesn't drink coffee, though.
What do you think is the future of those main streets in the context of placemaking? Not necessarily, Main Street versus Wall Street, but as a place, as a product, as an environment. Where does their future lie, do you think? Or where is it leaning?
There's some exciting stuff happening in the last 2 weeks in Milan, Seattle, Tampa, Los Angeles soon. The conversation about reopening, around the cyclovia movement and around the parklet movement to reclaim space from the automobile and rethink the public right of way as an instrument of social distancing. And how that could facilitate restaurants reopening. The fact that more space into the street for outdoor dining in the summer months could help rescue the restaurant from ruin. And for communities who love their restaurants and who understand the impact of restaurants in their community and who are neighbors with restaurant owners and restaurant workers. Communities who are agile enough to support that and embrace that this summer, I think will be seen as success stories. Those who do not, those who insist on the 4 parking spaces in front of a restaurant for parking, those restaurants will probably fail. So Brent Todarian is an urban planner out of Vancouver. He's been tweeting about this subject for the past 2.5, 3 weeks. He sat down with CBC's The Current, which is a news magazine and podcast about this subject. So I really think reclaiming street space is one of the first ingredients. It's also kind of the backbone of Jeanette Sadiq Khan's work in the book Street Fight, former transportation director for Mayor Bloomberg, in which a lot of street space was reclaimed in New York City. So I believe that for the next month, that'll be the topic of conversation, is how can restaurants and retail reopen by reclaiming street space.
I've always told people the best thing about working in small towns is 2 or 3 people can get almost anything done. And the worst thing about working in small towns is 2 or 3 people can kill almost any idea.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
What do you think? how do communities insulate themselves from the needed cultural shifts that I think are going to occur? And can the pandemic be a springboard for those discussions?
I think it has to be, but I think you and I have worked in enough small towns that are at the intersection between the understanding necessitated present need for change and a desire fueled by nostalgia, history, and heritage to preserve their identity way of life. I can recall doing a charrette in Bern, Indiana, in 1999 with my graduate studio, Professor Costello, and my graduate studio. My graduate studio has only 8 people, but it represented 6 different nationalities, and we were tickled to learn that the Chamber of Commerce director was still seen as a newcomer in Bern, Indiana, because she had only lived in Bern for 25 years.
She didn't go to high school there.
She was still seen as an outsider. We were tickled by the presence of Swiss fried potatoes on every menu of every restaurant. And it took me 3 days to figure out what Swiss fried potatoes were. They were American fries, but they were rebranded around a Swiss heritage that was so important to us. It took me 4 days to figure out who folks there, what language they spoke when they first came to the United States, because the answer I got for 4 days was they spoke Swiss. Well, anybody who's been to Switzerland knows that Switzerland has 4 official languages: Swiss German, Swiss French, Alt Romansh, and Italian. So eventually, after 4 days, it was Swiss Deutsch. It was Alemannisch Deutsch, which is the dialect of the Amish and Mennonites, and so it all kind of started to fall together. But I think at that critical intersection between preserving an identity and heritage and embracing the necessity of change, that's where the conflict occurs. That's where the mental conflict occurs. That's where the social conflict occurs. And that's unfortunately where a lot of these decisions have to be made, is in that realm of conflict and in that gray area.
What role do you think nostalgia plays in effective placemaking in a modern context?
Well, I think nostalgia was seen as a key to unlock some sort of sense of memory, but it actually ended up unlocking, I think, one added benefit or side effect of it, to use a prescription drug reference, was that it actually contributed to an authentic sense of place in a walkable environment. I'll use the example of Frankenmuth, because Frankenmuth is a place very near and dear to my heart. I could use Holland, Michigan, because I think the two communities really revitalized themselves in the 1970s and 1980s around their ethnic identities. In the case of Holland, Michigan, and West Michigan, it would be the Dutch ancestry and Dutch heritage, along with a large furniture-making cluster, fueled by Herman Miller and Knoll and the like. In Frankenmuth, northern Genesee County, north of Flint, it was a cluster of rural Bavarian Germans, Catholic and Lutherans, from Baden-Württemberg and from Bavaria, that settled there after the Civil War, and remade a small rural community with nothing more than a grain elevator around German heritage, and it became one of the #1 tourist destinations in the 1980s, with over 1 million visitors a year. And it rebranded around Michigan's Little Bavaria, and it added in this very bizarre kind of pastiche or applique architecture to all of the commercial buildings that were probably built Italianate originally, but then now covered with Bavarian bric-a-brac and Tyrolean kind of handiwork and ornament. But it was a success story for many, many years. But it was in that search for nostalgia that one discovered walkability, authenticity, sense of place, and including their last hurrah was something called the Cass River Landing, or the Frankenmuth Landing District, which was an outdoor mall built on the site of the former Carling Brewery, that where, let's say, 16 buildings were completely built in the image of Rothenburg. Rothenburg is one of the more picturesque parts of Bavaria. It's well photographed and used in a lot of different paintings, movies, and the like. But the thing that attracts people to it is that it's a walkable urban district. It's a facsimile of a walkable urban district, and that's, I think, why we've been so attracted to outdoor malls. and remaking small town Main Street or Main Street USA in urban lifestyle centers because we yearn for that level of walkability, for that scale, and for the security that that
Right.
perception gives. Not being in an enclosed space, understanding entrance and exit points, and now fresh air as a way of creating social distancing and allowing us to breathe fresh air. So all of that is connected now. So we've got all these different ingredients coming together. So yeah, just to summarize, what began as nostalgia and branding unlocked an awareness of walkable urbanism.
And it feels like so much a part of helping try to think through the hurdles and opportunities of a small town, especially as an outsider coming in to help, is trying as best you can to understand the framework of that nostalgia by local residents.
Yes.
Where does it come from? How did it get from A to B?
Right.
How has it evolved over time? And that isn't an easy thing to do. I think in some ways, you've effectively tried to tell that story in your sketching, in trying to understand that, just the progression of a brand, if you could call it a Main Street
Yes.
brand, and understanding the story, the timeline of that as a way to reiterate back to the community your interpretation of their nostalgic story.
Well, thank you. The modicum of sketching, or the discipline or active sketching, is I tell my first year students, it's an active memory, it's an active seeing. It's active. We talk about active listening meetings. Sketching is active seeing, because the designer then has internalized and truly processed mentally the details, proportions, colors, ornaments, scales, and materials of a district, of a neighborhood, of a community, of a small town. And you do that by the act of doing something with your eye, your brain, and your hands connected together. So that when you are asked to design, to plan, you have an internalized set of materials, proportions, ornaments, colors, methods that are appropriate for the place.
Is there something that sets apart a Midwestern Main Street from any other place in the country?
Yes, it has to do with how small towns in the Midwest grew, and when they grew, and when they hit their sort of growth spurt. The combination of fossil fuels or natural resources, in the case of the gas boom, or natural gas here in East Central Indiana, fueled by free sand coming from the Indiana dunes, transported by the new advent of the railroad vehicle. You put those three ingredients together and you have a booming society centered around natural gas extraction. The architecture of the time was Italianate architecture, fueled by a group of architects and illustrators going via steamship to Europe and filling up sketchbooks and creating pattern books, which then manufactured details, cornices, columns, pilasters in the foundries of northern Indiana. You marry that then to the limestone coming out of southern Indiana and the brick kilns coming out of Ohio, and you have an ingredient, a recipe for Italianate architecture that was immensely popular from 1872 to 1910. So, along with a couple of other companion styles that might be associated with craftsman's shingle style, Queen Anne. But the Italianate urban building, you look at the Indiana small town, it is fueled by pattern books that were generated by people who were visiting Rome, Florence, Venice, and Naples. And those pattern books led to the manufactured pieces of these urban buildings and the facades and ornaments. And that's what sets Indiana apart, is the concentration of Italianate buildings, that because of that particular era in history and of all these different ingredients coming together.
And it's funny, there's a comedian you and I both like that has a joke that, when Disney went to Europe, they had to make the castle bigger because Europeans actually knew how big a castle is supposed to be. in, in Indiana, we have downtowns laying around everywhere. So for a Hoosier to go to, Los Angeles or, Celebration, Florida, and see a modern downtown, you kind of quickly and almost, I think, instinctively know when things are appropriately scaled and when they're a little off. In these outdoor living malls, as a born and bred Hoosier, you kind of walk through and go, well, this isn't real. This isn't, the castle's not big enough.
Right.
And it's interesting that we now have an entire generation of people that, whether they know it or not, have those urban sensibilities.
Yes.
They just don't know how to articulate it in that way. But my hope is that that's an entire generation then that will help spearhead reevaluating how we think of planning, zoning, design ordinances in a way that can help in some way educate the general populace of what quality placemaking feels like.
I'm happy to educate a generation of students who every day seek authentic experiences.
Yeah.
Because they have access for the inauthentic. They've got that on their phone 18 hours a day, whether it be watching streaming video or playing Fortnite or whatever game of the week. They're okay. They're able to consume as much media as possible, basically into that streaming device as possible. It's the authentic experiences that stand out in their mind as the memorable parts of the day, the memorable parts of the week, or the memorable parts of the semester. And it's fueled by things like their love for things like vinyl records. The fact that you can hold it in your hand, you open it up, you look at the artwork, you look at the track listing, you look at the stories, you look at the liner notes, you look at the fonts. I mean, all these different design pieces and pieces of art that go into a vinyl record. They're embracing that authentic experience and then taking it out of the sleeve and placing it and putting the needle on and balancing it. I mean, I never thought that would ever be a thing, but it has, and it's taken off. And while it's declining now, I think it was 2 years ago, vinyl sales were exceeding that of MP3 sales. And so at the same time, that same consumer probably has a Spotify account and is allowing the algorithm to curate new artists and new bands and new songs. But their investment is in the vinyl record as a backup to that Spotify account, because Spotify will delete any number of artists that following months to make server space, et cetera. I mean, the same thing can go for lovers of cinema, in the sense that while Netflix has completely changed the way that we've consumed or understood cinema, Netflix algorithms can be very frustrating for the consumer. And number two, they'll remove significant parts of the library forever. And so the idea of having access to a DVD or some sort of backup to a historic film that's important in your life is still going to be there. So that duality right now is very interesting. It's interesting how we could take that metaphor for the vinyl record and apply it to placemaking.
And the vinyl record thing is interesting to me, and I don't know if this is wishful thinking on my part, but I can't help but see a hopeful kind of causal relationship or correlation with phenomena like an entire generation embracing vinyl records to an appreciation to some sense of slowness. That's the word I would. I mean, and you know what I mean by that. I think the idea that I could stream music meaninglessly in the background is different than the experience and event of listening to an album.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think having more events in your life to filter out the noise and superficiality of Instagram or Twitter culture, whatever that is something that for so long was going without, that it now becomes something that you have to actively seek. And placemaking is no different.
It's no different. I think you're onto something here, and that the pandemic has given us an opportunity to engage in slowness because we were going pretty darn fast before this, and this was a very, very fast interruption. And 60 days in, 59, 60 days in, I think the opportunities to embrace the slowness where they occur are going to retool our minds a little bit and retool our brains, and maybe even deal with our frontal cortex in a positive manner to embrace the slowness. Architect Todd Williams was talking about slowness 20 years ago. And so he's writing essays about it, and the value of that as a value in terms of how that shaped different architectural spaces and experiences in the work of Williams and Chen. I think this is an opportunity. You're hitting on a lot of different nails here.
Yeah, sorry. But to me, where if you were to try to define what differentiates Main Street America from everywhere else is, one is their inherent subconscious appreciation for scale, and their other is their sensibility and appreciation for slowness. And those two things are really what we're trying to achieve in a modern placemaking discussion. And they're abundant throughout the Midwest. We just have never really articulated them in that way. We haven't been able to tell that story for the same reason we don't consider ourselves robot operators.
Okay.
And so when we were talking about this, doing this discussion, I jokingly said, well, I just want to talk about where the overlap between people like Andrew Yang and Wendell Berry. And to me, that's what this is there is a sense of futurism to it. Where is this headed? The Midwest has no lack of makers, innovators, creative people doing amazing things all over the world. What makes them slightly different is kind of the other side of their brain, which is more Wendell Berry-esque, that we do understand and appreciate the act of slowness and the necessity for event. And that needs to be and remain a part of our everyday routine. And we've never really been able to package that and articulate it in a way that the masses could understand. But my pipe dream is that the last 60 days might be a perfect platform to start telling that story.
I think it is. I think it is a perfect platform. I'm reminded of Union City, Indiana, which is a community that straddles the Indiana and Ohio line. It's separated by a state border and I think a railroad and a couple of state roads. But Professor Spodek and I did a facade charrette over there with historic preservation students, probably 18 years ago now. But at the time, they had, there was this debate about which time Indiana should be on.
Right.
And so you could walk across the street and it'd be Eastern Daylight Time. You walk back across the street, it's Eastern Standard Time. So folks in Union City would adapt, and they say whenever it was an event or an appointment or otherwise, they would say, "Now is that going to be on fast time or slow time?"
Fast time or slow time?
Now that event, is that going to be on fast time or slow time? And so it just became part of the local culture that there were everything had two times. And so I proposed building a clock tower that had two clock faces facing each direction, and selling watches, making local watches that had both times on them, etc. It's kind of like in that part of the comedian documentary where Seinfeld asks, "What time is it in LA?" Well, it's always so many hours behind New York. It never changes, but you always, to make conversation, what time it is in LA. So a local community has been, I think, forced to adapt. And let's tap into something else here. We talk about a developed country, the developed world, versus the vernacular world, or the bad things that we call the third world. I mean, the negativity we associate with that, and that connotation reminds me of a poster that's placed in every single Jimmy John's. Now, that's a whole nother conversation about how you feel about Jimmy John's and his hunting habit. But there's a sign in every Jimmy John's that is the story of a fisherman and someone from the first world approaching the third world, if you can call it fisherman, and basically lecturing him about the means of production. Well, if you got a boat and hired three hands, you could catch more fish. Well, why would I need to do that? Spend more time with your family? And the fisherman says, "I already do." This idea of living where you work, working where you live, living closer with your family and the land, and paying attention to the weather and the landscape and moods and changes of your local natural world, those particular rhythms and those particular songs. That's all Wendell Berry. Um,
Yep.
But I think this opportunity of reconnecting with our neighborhoods in the West and our own homes and our own property um, have been a great opportunity over the last 60 days. I think real estate agents will be writing in their listings about this is a very quarantine-worthy home or a very quarantine-worthy property. Is this a place you would want to quarantine in? You would enjoy being quarantined in? Those kinds of questions. But I think that's also a way of reconnecting to our local places and historic places. Much in the way in the slower version of how Pokemon reopened historic elements and historic places to young people. That was very much for me a very interesting digital revolution that completely changed the way I thought about gaming and technology, because suddenly young people were exploring historic places in a new way because the Google Places directory had mapped out and marked out every single place of historic interest, every church, every cemetery, every historic building, every marker. And those became the places in the game. Those became the gems, those became the hubs for the characters in the game. And so I think that put together, and ironically, in the middle of a pandemic, there are still people playing Pokemon every day.
Yeah, right.
And because it is a walkable activity. So it kind of all comes together in that interesting way, back to what is a walkable community, and understanding that a walkable community is a resilient community.
Last question. When you hear the term rural extinction, what is your immediate reaction, and what would you say to a rural community coming out of these complicated times?
I think rural extinction was a concern that folks like you and I had for, I think, very legitimate reasons. But I think this pandemic has taught us that this is an opportunity for rural revival. Provided that they can get the connectivity, that base infrastructure of being able to dwell in a national or continental supply chain, access to information and distance communication where we communicate now. Provided that every American rural community can be part of that conversation at their will, at their demand, I think the playing field becomes incredibly level, right? Remember, Tom Friedman said the world is flat.
Right.
The pandemic is a way of flattening it again. Not to overuse the term flattening curves, but I think rural connectivity, in terms of that level of broadband infrastructure, would allow for a more level playing field, to allow rural communities to be part of a more resilient national or continental, US, Canada, Mexico supply chain. So I think this is a brilliant opportunity, and I encourage every political candidate for office to run with rural broadband as an issue.
Duly noted. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
It was good to talk to you. We'll do it again sometime. I could do this for hours. So
I as well. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Thanks, Lohren.
Bye.
This has been an episode of Health is Membership by MKM Architecture and Design.